Say hi to Brian. Brian is one of the writers of most of the things, right?
No, I'm not actually. Well, I'm not really a writer. We do write a lot of stuff together. It comes out under the Nankerfeld pseudonym, but Mick and Keith write more than any of us.
Thank you, Bill.
They're more industrious than we are.
In writing the songs that you write, do you sometimes think that you have a special inspiration for the way that you...
Well, you better ask about writing songs. Better address those questions to Mick and Keith, because they'll tell you more about it.
All
the
right.
ones that we've written together are just things that we've worked out together in the studio with somebody, anyone has had an idea.
If you had to do all over again, do you think you'd go the same route again as far as, now that you realize the demands that are put on you as a tremendous success?
I'd do it 100 times over if I could. I love it.
Good. Thank you so much. Let me swing over here and talk to Keith and to Mick.
Oh, yeah.
These are the two that are supposed to be all the writing talent. You fellows get together and do most of the writing, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's well, a lot of it. Some of it.
Do you have a particular inspiration for some of your songs that seem to springboard them out?
Well, I don't know. Ask Keith. I don't really think so. No, it just happens.
It just happened.
When the Stones were in L.A. at the end of October 1969 discussing preparations for the U.S. tour, Ahmet Ertegun was in his bungalow, a hotel, where he gets a knock on the door. It's a Stones roadie telling him Mick would like to talk to him in the studio. Ahmet was busy and he had to decline for that evening. The next morning, another knock, same roadie. Listen, man, Mick wants you to come down. So Ahmet goes, and he was very welcomed by everybody. Later that evening, Ahmet goes out for drinks with a DJ, Billy Drake. They drink plenty. Now, Ahmet is extremely jet-lagged, and he tells Bill he has a meeting with Mick at the Whiskey A Go-Go at 12:30 a.m. That's 3:30 a.m. Ahmet's body time. Ahmet gets there at 12 with Bill. They have a few women with them, and Chuck is performing on this October Eve. Ahmet drinks more, and then Mick arrives at 12:30 on the dot. He sits down and starts telling Ahmet their recording plans. They're talking away, but this is when Ahmet starts dozing off. One of the girls shakes Ahmet to wake him up, telling him this is Mick Jagger talking to you. Mick was telling him that the Stones have decided to sign on with Atlantic, his label. Still, while Ahmet falls asleep. Ahmet had met the band 5 years earlier in '64 in New York City at Ahmet's friends in an apartment. Welcome all. Before I move into the Sticky Fingers time period documentary, I feel that many Stones fans heard about these names that I will mention and have some idea of their connection with the Stones. I'm not going to go into a deep explanation, but enough that should get you to understand where the Stones' heads were at and what they were being faced with during this time period leading up to Sticky Fingers. I used multiple resources of books, written and actual interviews I watched, websites as my resource, and keeping it to as actual as I can. There's still questions I have, but I got a better idea and insight now in sharing what I found. I'm introducing you to the Stones' two-headed monster and their three-headed genius team. It will be Alan Klein, Decca, Prince Rupert Lowenstein, Marshall Chess, Rolling Stones Records, and Ahmet Ertegun of Atlantic. A huge challenge to gather all this detail in so many rabbit holes. I wanted, of course, to make sure the accuracy was delivered. But with this information, it's a real challenge. Contracts, copyrights, publishing rights, royalties, financial numbers. It gets me all friggin' cross-eyed. But it's real hot topic we need to understand. I cannot possibly include all the details of the events, but give enough for you to walk away with a better understanding. Introducing the one head of the monster which heads to the other head, Alan Klein. He was born in '31 in Newark, New Jersey. Parents were from Hungary. His mom died when he was less than 1 year old. His father left him with his grandparents for 3 years. Then he was moved to an orphanage and shelter house. His father was a butcher. He remarried around when Alan was 10 years old. and it was that time he and his sister got to meet their father. Klein would graduate Newark's Weequahic High School in 1950, and while working during high school, he worked at Newark Essex County News. He would be introduced how cheating was performed. He saw that invoices were billed inadvertently. A $23.16 invoice was changed purposely to $32.16, and if the candy stores or newsstands found the issue, then they would get an apology and a refund, but most of the time it wasn't noticed. Wanting to go to college, he knew his dad could not afford it, so he joined the Army, and after the Army, he used the GI Bill to go to college. Graduated Uppsala College in East Orange, New Jersey, in accounting in 1956. He joined Harry Fox Agency, a licensing organization specializing in collection of royalties. He then created his own accounting firm. Having a good idea now of the laws, he helped clients get royalties from Roulette Records, which was a label owned by the Mafia. He helped Bobby Darin, Bobby Vinton, Sam Cooke with royalties. In 1959, Klein meets Bobby Darin at a wedding. He'll introduce himself and tell Bobby he can make him $100,000. Darin will say, "Well, what do I need to do?" Klein tells him nothing. "Just let me look at your accounts." Darin gives Klein all what he needs, and Klein gets him the $100,000 check. Klein just searched the books that the label has not paid Darin. That was it. It's a legitimate shakedown that Klein does. Once he sees that this was done by the label, he pulls forward and no mercy. Record companies would start fearing Klein. That became his reputation, and did this for the second wave of the British invasion, those artists. He knew about all the interactions between manufacturing, sales, royalties, and publishing. This group of areas really shouldn't be done by one person, though, as it would become a conflict of interest in allowing double and triple dipping. Klein was extremely focused, and he was hardworking in his craft. In '63, he negotiated Sam Cooke's deal with RCA. Klein had served papers to RCA requesting an audit on Sam's royalties. He ended up getting $110,000 back payment for Cooke, and Klein got 25%. Labels knew that many artists were not savvy enough and had no lawyers or high-end legal representation, so Klein knew how to get into contracts and get artists their due money for royalties. This is why so many early artists from the 50s and 60s were so angry. And I'm also going to add, this is why so many current artists are still angry. In '64, while in England, Klein became the business manager for U.S. of producer Mickey Most. He produced The Animals, Herman's Hermits, Kinks, Donovan, Pete Townsend. He would get the better deals for them. It was about protecting the artists from the Brits' high taxes when they made money outside England. Klein had it drawn up to pay artists overtime up to 20 years. Klein took the money and invested it and took that profit, and he kept it. He was the overseer of the money.
This is Eric Easton, the manager of the Rolling Stones. Stay tuned for Ed Rudy's coverage on the Rolling Stones.
Eric, you're the manager of the Rolling Stones, the world's most popular recording group at this point, right?
Well, that is correct.
How would you account for their phenomenal success?
I think because they've got a very different image from most of the other groups. It's a wonderful image. It fits in with what the teenagers want today. I don't think the adults go for them in a big way, but the kids, they think they're absolutely the tops. In England, they're the next biggest to the Beatles. In fact, they're equal with the Beatles. And I think before we finish this tour of the States, I think they'll be just as big here. The Rolling Stones have to be seen and heard to be believed.
Now, it was Eric Easton that negotiated the Stones' publishing and recording contracts. The other business manager, we know, Andrew Loog Oldham. I talk about Easton in other documentaries. So at this time period, both Easton and Oldham were not on speaking terms. And very important, Klein was already Oldham's financial manager, personal, at this time also, and not the Stones. Klein wanted the Stones, and he was positive and told Oldham that he can get a new and a happy contract for U.S. and England. Oldham would say, talk to Mick. So why not talk to Brian Jones? Well, Brian had the title as founder of the Stones, and he had the prior contact with Easton and Oldham. But there was some sourness going on when Brian took an additional £5 a week bonus. We know how masterful and talented Brian was as a musician, but he would take 2 steps backwards as being a bandmate and became undependable. Plenty occurred when LSD was introduced on a U.S. tour. He would disappear for days at times and fail to show up at performances. The easy part of having a band is the playing. The hardest part is to keep the band together and keep all egos and personalities in check. Keith would say he never saw a guy so much affected by fame it became a real pain. Oldham felt the same. Brian fans would counter and point out how Brian was treated. That would cause the isolation in his responses. I said it before and will say it again. Brian's dad said losing Anita was his start of the spiral.
Brian had been making me feel pretty bad for a long time because he wasn't really thinking too much about playing. He seemed to be bitter about various things, and when I first met him, he was a really nice guitar player who could play various styles. He still felt he was leader of the group for a couple of years after it started, and he used to be a bit bitter under the surface that Mick was the leader of the group, not him, and the fact that they were recording all Mick and Keith's songs. I mean, Brian was incapable of writing music, and so I'm not really quite sure what else he wanted them to do. And then he rather lost interest in guitar playing whatsoever. He did break his wrist one time in Africa. And from then on, he just didn't want to play guitar. He played soprano sax on a Beatles B-side. But he just seemed to lose all heart, and he was talking about leaving anyway. So, I mean, I wasn't surprised. I didn't really feel particularly bad about it because he was potentially brilliant and a very, very intelligent person. But he just seemed to be set on destroying himself.
Around July '65, Mick was on holiday in the U.S. Satisfaction was number 1. Easton and Oldham, they set up Impact, which owns or retains ownership of the master tapes, which are then leased to Decca. Impact gets 14% royalty from Decca, and they in turn would pay the Stones 6% of it. Easton and Oldham will then also take 25% management fee from that 6% of the Stones. Mick flew to Miami to meet both Klein and Oldham. They were both attending the CBS Records Convention, and they were there to meet and talk to Clive Davis, head of CBS, Columbia. Oldham had discussed with Mick prior about how Klein's negotiating was intense. So when the three met, all the conversation was Klein asking Mick if he wanted him to help them out, Oldham doing his thing, and Mick replying, yes, and he gets up and leave. Andrew would bring Klein in, as Klein was Oldham's personal finance manager, as I mentioned. The Stones needed a hard-nosed business and advocate advisor. Stones would not have to pay the 20% fee to Klein. That comes from Easton and Oldham. Klein would fly to London eventually and to speak to the other Stones. Bill was not a fan of Oldham, and he also was against Klein, but he was overruled. Keith from the outside would think that Klein's moves were real savvy and glad to see how Klein helped him conquer the U.S. and become global. Klein would spend time in his New York office listening to the Stones and going over every dot of the Andrew Loog Oldham and Stones documents and contracts. From what he saw, there was renegotiation room for contract improvement, but he was not sure if he had his hands on the entire story. Now, it was Eric Easton that negotiated the Stones' publishing and recording contracts. I talk about Easton in other documentaries. So at this time period, both Easton and Oldham were not on speaking terms. Now here's a twist. Oldham had outside interests going on. His idol Phil Spector and Oldham wanted to create a new label, hence to meet Clive Davis in Florida. Klein would help Oldham with a distribution deal in US and CBS. Oldham wanted to take the American influence and bring it to England. He created Immediate Records.
What was the year you stopped managing him? So?
67.
And then you sold it to, you sold out, so to speak. You moved the contract, the management situation and publishing and everything over to, what, Alan Klein?
Well, the records, the publishing had already been, was already with Alan. The records came later, and the management was kind of a movable, unwritten feast that I don't think anybody wants to lay claim to. Alan will go, no man, I didn't manage him, because that has the implication that he took them from me, which is an implication Alan doesn't deserve.
Okay. And then, so that was 67. Is that when Immediate Records started?
No, Immediate Records started in 1965 with when we were lucky enough to get for, oh, well, not that lucky, we should have more than the UK. For the UK and Air, Hang On Sloopy.
By?
The McCoys.
Oh, you did? Oh,
Yeah.
the hit version.
And so, you know, as everybody in those days, even Wes Farrell, you know, you started a label, you had a hit. And we were lucky enough to start with Hang On Sloopy, 3 records, Nico, and then another record produced by Jimmy Page, and Hang On Sloopy went top 10. Then we had a kind of cold period until Mick Jagger produced Chris Farlow, and then we bought the Small Faces from Don Arden and Decca, and that was 60. So 67, yes, is when Immediate started to come to actual permanent prominence for a couple of years.
It was actually a fantastic label. They had some great clients and studio musicians. The album's quality and sound was perfection. Now the Stones were with the England's Decca label and US version London label, the second head of the monster. Decca was paying Easton and Oldham the royalties directly at this time of the Stones. Klein took the Stones to Decca in a rented Rolls-Royce. Klein prepped them and said not to say anything and look mad and angry. Klein still had a bit of hesitancy of not knowing everything in the contracts. And as they were going in, Klein grabbed Oldham and he took him into the bathroom at Decca. He would ask him, "Who makes these records?" Oldham would say, "They all do." "Okay then, let's go." Decca saw that Easton was not there and present. They said they didn't want to talk without Easton there. Why not? Does he play an instrument? Silence. Then Klein continues to ask for the royalty statements. They were signed in 63 and now it's 65. Stones were in contract already, and this was a mid-contract renegotiation. So threats go back and forth. And Sir Edward would say how they got a good team of lawyers and we got a contract. Klein would come back and say, I hope they could sing because you just lost the Stones. Both would stand ground. Decca had a point that the contract continues, it was signed, and there shouldn't be any renegotiation. But Decca would crumble. And the Stones, they never received a royalty payment. Klein then asked to see the license agreements that involved all the Decca locations. I'm going to be back tomorrow. Decca still asks why no Easton. Klein gets up and responds, you'll have to ask him. Next day, Klein is back there at Decca and he received a new contract. It was still in Decca's advantage. Decca threw out the number of $300,000 was a figure that they could make, but given in advance. It also depends on the sales. Klein says that this is an insulting offer. Several days later, Klein walks back in, shows a new contract, $600,000 guaranteed as an advance against royalties for a one-year contract paid over several years. This allows for less tax concerns. The contract was signed and Klein gave the Stones the first year's advance. Just like England, Klein then worked the same contract model with the US-Canada London Records, $600,000 in advance. Klein kept the contracts to 1 year, as he knew Easton would be out the door. Next year, a new contract at $700,000. Now Stones are guaranteed a total of $2.6 million. Klein had bragging rights how the Stones had better contracts than the Beatles, which did piss off McCartney, who gave Brian Epstein an earful. Easton comes and attacks and sues Klein for convincing the Stones to breach the recording and management agreements that were signed by Brian Jones. Klein dug in more and saw how Easton and Oldham were not just getting their money from royalties, but took 25% on top of all that. They were double dipping. So Klein demanded that Oldham make changes. Oldham sends a formal letter stating royalties are now at 7%, up from 6%, because of their success. The 25% double commission of royalties would also no longer be charged. He added a line in the letter saying it's not ethical or fair that they do this. Now Marianne was on Decca and she got similar changes also from manager Oldham. Royalties went from 2% to 12%. Klein did have a bit of a crush on Marianne. Now for publishing. It usually went 50-50, publishers and songwriters. Gideon Music published songbooks and sheet music. Gideon Music would pay Jagger, Richards, and Oldham 72 cents per dollar. Andrew got 14, and Jagger and Richards got 29 cents each. Klein was looking at that remaining 28 cents on the dollar. So Klein was hustling. There was some positive vision from him, but he did have some internal motive. He would guarantee the Stones at least $1 million in advance in '65, and with success, it would go to $3 million. This would be paid annually in installments over 20 years. Minimize the taxes. Now, Klein became their music publisher and give them support on tours. All the extra money would be paid at the end. Klein had a nephew working for him as an assistant, was a fan of the Stones, but did not think the Stones were pop material. They just had one hit. Klein pulled another move on the publishing. In the U.S., the top publishing company was the Richmond Organization, also known as TRO. They had a grip on all musicals, folk music, big bands. TRO also owned a British version company, Essex music. So Music Publishers represents the songwriters and manages the copyrights of the music and also lyrics. So if a film, TV show, video game, merchandise, ringtone, audiovisual use, then a license must be obtained from the publisher as they manage it. So what Klein did, he had TRO, Essex Music, be a sub-publisher for Gideon Music in North America. I'll mention now a real good book that I used, as I mentioned before. I'm skimming the book surface just to get you some time flow here and what the story's about. Fred Goodman, Alan Klein, the man who transformed rock. Great insight and a lot of Beatles information here also. We've seen these pictures from Linda Eastman, these photos. The start of their tour and promo opportunity, these were taken on the Hudson River, New York City, on Alan Klein's yacht. As the Stones had their American success in tours and sales, they were becoming more popular and their money was going higher than their guarantee, beyond expectations. This extra money was to be paid in a balloon payment, future payout, not now. Getting this large amount of money, a financial disaster for tax purposes. Now Klein knew of a British built-in tool mechanism for taxes. It was called dropout year. It would allow British citizens to live abroad, only temporary, and not come back to England for a year, and the government granted a year's tax amnesty. Klein had Donovan do this in Japan, but Donovan got homesick and wanted to be back with his girlfriend, Linda Lawrence, who was the mother of Brian Jones's son. He forfeited the year and it cost him $7 million, and he got married. Stones had no interest in this tax loop. Bringing up Nanker Felge, the name Nanker was a term founded by the Stones when they make those distorted facial expressions. And Felge was their flatmate in 62-63 in Edith Grove. He was a gross character. They combined the two words. Oldham, he found a loophole early on to get royalties for no other reason. They used the name Nanker Felge as an incognito name representing all the Stones and Andrew. Brian thought of the name for all to get equal shares of royalty. Now here's a list of songs that went under Nanker Felge, 63 to 65. Some changed during time and some unreleased. Now Alan Klein would get himself as an owner of Nanker Felge in the U.S., not England's, but U.S. Just a note, Beggars and Let It Bleed, original vinyl, had Nanker Felge credited, but would eventually be removed. So Klein came up with another scheme. Rather than getting to claim, they would get stocks instead. He thought they could sell their shares of these stocks and the money would be for the capital gains, which avoided the high tax penalty. Constant rabbit holes and projects done by Klein, a real challenge to keep this to a logical flow here when I'm presenting. A lot of info. Klein wanted to get into films. He actually looked at buying MGM, but Seagram's owner beat him out. Not sure where he would generated that money to buy them. Klein, being shrewd in July 67, did a pivot and would approach the principal stockholder of a Philly-based label founded in 1956. This was called Cameo Parkway Records. They had doo-wop, dance, pop, rockabilly, garage rock, soul, and novelty. They weren't doing so well. Their stock shares were at $2. Owner William Bowen was desperate. Klein bought 297,000 shares at $1.75, and Klein's partner, Abby Butler, bought the remaining, and they owned 56%. In 1968, Klein would change his label name to ABKCO. Alan, his wife Betty, Klein, and Company. ABKCO Music and Records Incorporated. I mentioned partner Abby Butler. Well, Abby did work in the American Stock Exchange as a broker. Word started getting around as these stocks moved quickly. They exploded to $76.38 in February of '68. The government, the SEC, got wind and noticed this, put a halt on this to stop the increase. Now Klein asked Butler to start an account in the name Nanker Felge, then buy $1 million worth of General Motors stocks for this account. So when the Stones saw payments being made to Nanker Felge, but it's not to the England account, it was sent to Klein's USA. The Stones would not benefit at all with the investments Klein was making. Klein reaped the profits, similar to the way bank takes your money and invests it and gives you just a small interest. So the Stones are just getting their own due money over time. Klein would not share this info nor show any reports. No one was able to advise or determine what was going on. Klein would then quickly open 6 more accounts, each with large sums of money. Klein was getting real sneaky, putting the Stones' money into his American account and not the Stones' UK account. There was also some small print in their contract that the Stones didn't pick up on. This became apparent now and became nasty. Butler was now questioning Klein. Who, what, where, why, how? Butler would learn these accounts contained money paid to the Rolling Stones, Herman's Hermits, Donovan, Bobby Vinton, Kinks, Animals. Klein and Butler would travel to London and Italy together many times. Klein was back on chasing film projects again. He partnered with an actor, Tony Anthony, for spaghetti westerns. He wanted to acquire a company. Now back to the government, the SEC, an audit, and the stock failure halt. It was found Klein did not complete an SEC government audit, so ABKCO did not get reinstated. They instead traded publicly over the counter and stocks plummeted. The IRS government remembers everything. In '63, an IRS agent was sent on a normal visit to Alan Klein back then about a late filing for withholding taxes paid and paperwork was not filled out correctly. So purposely, Klein made the agent wait many hours at his office, and he didn't even meet with him at the end of the day. So the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they protect of misconduct and promotes fairness in the stock market. So the SEC returned back in '68 during the stock's complexity. We're going to meet Klein, and he pulled another stunt, and he would swindle out of his meeting. Rules did not matter to Klein. His way or the highway. Klein hustled and made things happen, yeah. He used harsh and brash attacks, bullying, and also some creativity. This is why artists and managers liked him. They felt he was really doing the best for them. Well, at least in the early relationships. Klein had one thing in mind, and that was what and how he will benefit. So it became apparent to the IRS Klein was not a keen financial manager, but had found a loophole with creativity for creating revenue. Next topic is APCO and how they become the middleman. Klein followed his model of negotiating new record contracts which would increase advances for him. Klein saw how the record company contracts were designed not to owe the artists much money. They would give advancement money, that was nice, but they charged them for everything, and the artists made pennies. He knew he could flip this around. Many would ask, why did it take so long that artists to realize they were not happy with Klein? The initial setups Klein did were great and advantageous, and it helped break the Stones into America. This was a critical business move back then. He did do it. But as time went on, the Stones evolved from boys to men and broke away from the pack. The band's perspective started to change. Now, Klein didn't give proper advice as a business manager or educate the Stones. If a question is asked to the Stones, what do you want? Well, they would say, I want $1 million. That'd be their answer. So Klein would just focus on that rather than propelling them down the right path with proper business guidance. He should have said, that's not what you should be thinking or asking for. What they should be asking for is control over their career. What is their true market value? So this is where Klein failed in this area, as he was not a mentor and he was in it for himself. He negotiates another deal. APCO will manufacture and deliver records to the labels at an agreed price, and APCO is the manufacturer. So for example, Stones were due 7% royalties of a record's list price. We'll say $4.98 an album. Stones get 30 cents per album. You also got to subtract contractual allowances for any returns and breakage. So Klein gets that 20%, which comes from Easton Oldham. London Records would pay APCO $1.25 per album. This is used for royalty payments, record-making costs with packaging and other fees. The artist saw money, but APCO was making out. Klein did not perform as a business manager, but made all think he was. Money was there, but did not say how it came in. And APCO was responsible for many other functionalities for the Stones: manufacturing, promoting, hiring publicists, radio station interaction, advertising, overseeing design of record store shelves, and supervising American tours. Klein and Decca wanted the Stones to get an album out for the holidays. During these sessions, it was not business as usual. At the sessions, the band was very loose without tunes or an agenda to work off. Tape just ran with noodling around, experimentation, and the Stones wanted Oldham out. He was useless now. Andrew knew this. The Stones were late getting to the studio and taking acid, hence the album's style. Andrew wanted out, he walked out. Mick was so annoyed this guy was making more money than him. Oldham did not do anything with regards to the '67 drug busts. Nothing with legal defense, financially. He went to the U.S. to get away, in fact. Probably feared that he was a target also to get busted. And that had to leave the Stones with a real bitter taste during this chaotic '67 time period. Oldham would say, "My work here is done." In 1967, during the sessions, he would say managing the Stones was never tough until I could not keep a handle on myself. Then I had to leave. Oldham was gone by the end of '67, drugged, out of sorts, shock therapy, 23 years old. We do know his ulterior motives. He did succeed. He did move on. Oldham would tell Klein that Decca had offered him $800,000 for his rights, but Oldham wanted Klein to buy it. Easton Oldham owned the Stones' master recordings and leased them to Decca in London. So in '68, Klein bought out Oldham and settled with Easton. For $1.5 million, he bought 50% royalty share in everything the Stones recorded. Until early '71, the first two recordings of 2 songs on Sticky. Total 11 studio albums and EPs, 2 live albums and comps. Klein was now the advisor, publisher, record manufacturer, and Stones partner, which would equate to a conflict of interest. Klein just bought what was presented. It was not a scam, but he was salivating. Klein would probably use the Stones' money to buy the song rights. Here's an example of the brashness of Klein. He owned the Sam Cooke tunes. In 1984, he got a preview of the Harrison Ford movie Witness. In it, there was a scene where there was a slow dance using Sam Cooke's Wonderful World. He knew they wouldn't reshoot this scene, and he demanded $200,000, and he got it. Keith would telex Klein plenty, asking for money for his new home at Cheney Walk. No response. Keith decided to send his close inner circle assistant, Tom Keelock, to New York. Keelock gets there, plows through the offices and through the receptionist and right to Klein's office. He took a seat and he told Klein he's not going to move until he gets Keith's money. That's what it took. Mick would also be at Cheney Walk. Keith sold this in 1978. In 1968, Rock and Roll Circus. Mick's assistant, Peter Swales, would mention how Klein tried to sabotage his event by holding back funds for it. He also failed to hire Dr. John and Flying Burrito Brothers, who the Stones wanted. Klein would not answer telegrams when Mick was asking for money for the entire production. Mick would have to find the money himself £40,000 to get this studio. Now, the 1969 Hyde Park tapes of the show were hidden in a toilet. Upon request by Mick to Peter Swales not to give these tapes to Klein at all, Klein would show up at the 46A Maddox Street Stones office. He told Peter he was there to collect the tapes. Peter says, "Sorry, I can't give them to you." Klein physically grabbed Peter by the throat and throws him across the office. The hidden tapes in the toilet were given to Klein by Peter.
We'll take you down by the riverside.
In the spring of '70, the Decca Records contract was ending. Klein would talk with executives at RCA, EMI, Capitol, talk to them about the Stones situation. But it was Mick who would be the real point person of the contact to discuss with executives and labels. Mick was interested in Amit at Atlantic and Clive Davis at Columbia. Both Klein and Mick would visit Capitol, but this was a long shot, as he wanted to be the top band for the label. With Klein being less involved with the Stones, he would get a letter from the Stones' lawyers after his Capitol visit with Mick. The letter would say that APCO will not be negotiating the new record deal, and Prince Rupert Lowenstein was to start handling all financials going forward. You'll hear more about Lowenstein shortly. Klein was supposedly shocked and perplexed to hear this and wanted to meet with Mick, both with different intentions though. Mick wanted to get cash from Klein. So to recap from Klein's perspective, he got his 20% from Easton and Oldham. He bought out Oldham, settled lawsuits of Easton, charged against the Stones. APCO had Easton Oldham recording rights. APCO was to receive 50% royalties on every album. You may think, why didn't Oldham just go right to the Stones with this opportunity to buy? He thought they would not be able to pay for them. Plus the bad blood, bad contracts, and Oldham knew Klein had the cash, and it would be an easier transaction, and he could stay in business. The biggest thought the Stones would have, they're paying for something they felt should have not ever been taken from them. So as I mentioned before, a conflict of interest in Klein's model was now evident. Manage the band, but also have the Stones signed to APCO, an unorthodox formula which benefited Klein. David Geffen would follow this. Bill Graham did also for concert business. Graham did not change with the times, though. Mick got smart in 1989 and would turn over the concert promoting to Canadian Michael Cole. Mick grew tired of Graham's tactics. The bottom line, artists need to get paid for their work. Bill would say how if one of them wanted to purchase a home or a car, instruments, offices, dope, Klein would hand them the cash, which was really theirs, and charge them interest. They sent many telexes to Klein in New York, wanting money released. Mick would get his £25,000 so he can purchase a broken-down Stargroves. He also needed money for the repairs. Let me quickly paint the Lowenstein picture. Lowenstein started as a stockbroker for Bache & Company, a securities firm that would provide stock brokerage and investment banking services. In '63, Lowenstein would join up with college friend Jonathan Guinness from the Guinness family, and they would acquire the private merchant bank Leopold Joseph, founded in 1919. This bank would cater to the wealthy, not the public, and Rupert was part owner and director. Looking ahead, Rupert left Leopold Joseph and started his own company in 1981. Rupert now preferred working with new money, those type of clients, rather than old money. These clients were more interesting to him. Prince Rupert Lowenstein invented a rock and roll business model that would work for the artists and work for maximizing income from touring, music, publishing, and recording, and allow for minimal exposure to the UK tax by living abroad. He would restructure the Stones as a blue-chip company, each a member and as a partner. Mick Taylor was on salary, though. So what this meant was Lowenstein would incorporate a series of subsidiary companies that handled all the different functional areas of the business for the band, different teams to look after different areas. With Klein's model, the band did not pay any taxes in almost 5 years. It was 1968 when Prince Rupert Lowenstein would meet Mick. Lowenstein was a merchant banker and also fluent in the art scene. With our background about Klein and Oldham and their way of handling the Stones, Mick was concerned with the state of the Stones' finances. They were not seeing money and they were overdrawn. Mick had confided with an art dealer friend, Christopher Gibbs, and he wanted to see what his upper-class status can flex and find the Stones an accountant that can meet their needs. Gibbs had tried finding a source and he'd come up empty. He heard about concerns like they were long-haired, degenerates, and unprofitable slugs. That is when Gibbs reached out to Lowenstein, who never heard of the Stones. He was totally out of the pop scene. So Lowenstein did some research and saw their success, but also saw their drug convictions. Lowenstein now recalls meeting Mick once before at an elite banking friend's home in Chelsea. They threw an informal party, and Lowenstein remembers walking into a smoke-filled room. Everyone was high, and Lowenstein actually tripped over Mick. So Lowenstein would meet Mick at his Cheney Walk home. Not a lot of furniture there yet, except for recent Moroccan pieces. Mick was telling him, "I have no money and none of us do." And Lowenstein couldn't understand why no money trickled down. So Lowenstein understood the sparse amount of furniture now. After talks, both Mick and Lowenstein clicked. They were even on personal levels. He felt Mick was an honest and sensible and saw how Mick was taken for a ride. And Lowenstein did think he could find a way out for this difficult situation. So Lowenstein invited Mick to his home a few days later, so his well-trusted wife, Josephine, could feel him out. She met Mick at the door. They both talked some while drinking some sherry, and then she would go fetch Rupert, letting him know after 15 minutes how charming he was. Musically, both Rupert and Joe were so far apart from the rock and roll world. Now, Rupert was getting bored with the corporate financial world, so this new venture would be a challenge for him. Also, his bank, Leopold Joseph, did not have any interest in this project with the Stones. Many new bands were losing money, and there had to be a change, as this was also not about music, but how to run a business. The business idea was not something that would come easy for bands, and to be able to jump on this fast business train, they would have to know about tax rules and regulations. Now, just a little tangent here. Mick met Jan Wenner in July '68 while in LA for Beggar's Banquet. Glyn Johns introduced them, as Glyn was involved with both Mick and Jan. Glyn Johns would meet Jan at a dinner of Jan's neighbor, Boz Scaggs, in San Francisco. The tie-in is Steve Miller Band. Lynn Johns was asked about an investment for a new startup that Jan was doing, but he declined and offered to introduce Mick to him. Mick had an opportunity with his new friend, Jan Wenner. Jan wanted to start a magazine in England. He was already established in the U.S. Jan had thought to bring in the Stones and give them 49%, but Mick could not raise the money, £5,000. Mick asked Rupert if his company, Leopold Joseph, would lend it to him. It was ironic because Mick had an idea of starting a magazine himself. Now, after this meeting with Mick in London, Jan would go back and want to show how serious he was with Mick and the Stones. He went back to San Francisco to write a complete Beggar's Banquet review for the U.S. Rolling Stone magazine. He compared Mick to Dylan lyrically and called it their best. In August 10, 1968, Jan put Mick on the cover for the first time, The Return of the Rolling Stones. But the bad news was Lowenstein's company would reject this request. There was no way, no security to back this up. It was a startup. After some wasted time, Rupert did get the go-ahead from Leopold Joseph. They did think about it, and they wanted to put the offer out, but it didn't work due to timing. Alan Klein had sent Jan a cease and desist letter for misrepresentation of the name, for commercial benefit. Also a copyright name violation. Klein demanded Jan to retract and destroy all copies or suffer legal actions and lawsuits. Jan knew Joe Bergman and called to get an interview with Mick. He wrote to Mick also to get the lawsuits removed. Mick saw how the Beatles were using Rolling Stone as a promo tool. Apparently, no suing was involved. Now, Rupert was still meeting with Mick and reviewing and studying the piles and piles of documents of their finances. He would become the Stones' financial advisor and later become their business manager. He would become the brains behind the financial and business issues. Now, Rupert did grow closer with both Mick and Mary Ann. Rupert described in his book that Mary Ann had sort of a wayward, lost girl persona. Now, Rupert knew many aristocrats. He and Joe were invited to spend Christmas with great friends in '68, invited to spend at the Warwick Castle by a lord and Lady Brooke. Rupert knew Mick might enjoy this type of moment and would give Rupert a good chance to see how Mick interacts with the elite. A test, but also a risk for Rupert. It was agreed that they would be invited. There would be some difficult moments, though. At first, Mick and Mary Ann arrived very late. They drove up in a Bentley, and they had a green flag of Prophet on it. Alan Dunn, Mick's assistant, was driving. The green flag of the Prophet is associated with an Islam and a traditional symbol. No idea why or how it was on the car, but it was noticed by somebody and it becomes some internal rumbling. Mary Ann would stay in the bedroom 90% of the time, and Mick had a cover for this. So the story goes, Lady Brooke poured water into Mary Ann's bed, thinking Mick and Mary Ann were some bad influences on their children. Now, it was during '68, Rock and Roll Circus, that Mick would introduce Alan Klein to John Lennon. This was weeks prior to Mick meeting Rupert. Keep that in mind. And Alan Klein was licking his chops. to meet Lennon. In '64, Klein had offered the Beatles Entourage and offered Brian Epstein an opportunity to sign with RCA in the U.S. for $2 million. He was turned down as Epstein was loyal to EMI. So as I mentioned, talking to Lennon was pre-Rupert. But after Mick met Rupert and connected with him and figured out his new direction, Mick called back Lennon and McCartney and told them he was retracting what he recommended and gone to Rupert to move ahead. I think you should do the same thing. I'm not happy about the introduction I did for Klein. However, it was too late. The cancer has struck. Now, Lee and John Eastman, that's Linda Eastman's brother and father, lawyers, they knew of Klein from New York City. McCartney had helped on trying to dilute this fiasco. And when Brian Epstein passed in '67, the Beatles needed help. Eventually. Klein said in '64 he was going to have the Beatles one day. When he heard Epstein died, he knew he got them. We know about the Brazilian vacation in December '68 to January '69. Mick, Marianne, Keith, and pregnant Anita. Rupert is the one that organized this trip, as he was friends with a high-end Brazilian financier and politician, Walter Moraria Salles. Walter was a U.S. ambassador, and he also revolutionized the Brazilian banking industry. So Rupert arranged for them to stay at his large plantation 300 miles north of Rio. Now, as you can see also in some of the footage, they went to Peru. I'm almost certain it was on this trip at this time period.
I'm strolling on the boulevards of Paris, as naked as the day that I will die.
Rupert saw how sleazy and oily Klein was. Rupert's job was to get them to escape from Klein and Decca contracts with minimal damage. They had no leverage or freedom to look at any other record company. The Decca contract was normal, but the Klein contract was atypical. That is when Rupert organized a financial team of advisors of Leopold Joseph, and they came in. What a break. Touring was no way to make money, as Rupert saw the books and realized how dodgy the business was. Rupert knew with the skills and power the Stones had on stage that they should be making plenty of money. It was obvious that bands that perform well could make the money, and this money should be going to the performers and not the promoters. So Rupert got his colleagues and lawyers to review their truckload of documents, pro bono, for free. Rupert negotiated this. Here is where Mick's brilliance comes in fruition. He was the point person for the band in the business world and was close to Rupert. Rupert would meet the Stones individually, and it took months to get Keith to meet up. When he did show up, Rupert found him impressive. Rupert would say he saw Keith as the most intelligent mind of all the band, a seasoned street smart lad. Now, Rupert had some challenges with the older contracts. They were written in Brian Jones's name. But then that horrible day came, and now they would have Mick Taylor's name. Mick would help Rupert and Joe in organizing on July 3rd, 1969, a white ball to be held at their residence in Holland Park. Mick's assistant got the newcomer band Yes to play there. They kept neighbors up until 6 a.m., and when police arrived during the night, they couldn't do anything due to Princess Margaret was there. Mick wore the outfit he wore at Hyde Park, and Mary Ann would arrive to a white ball in a black dress. Now, the Stones were in Olympic Studio, we know, when they heard Brian died on July 3rd. But that July 3rd evening was the white ball. The July 5th Hyde Park, which Rupert attended, Rupert was very impressed and excited seeing this spectacular phenomenon. He was now aware of the extraordinary power of the band, and especially Mick's aura. Not a technical expertise, but he had that star quality. Now, Rupert saw that Klein controlled the Stones' money and would release it when he felt. He took money and would only release tiny amounts of income before tax. Klein had no statements of accounts to give up. Decca would have statements and also Oldham, which Rupert would get. It would take 18 months into 1970 when the Stones' existing contracts would come to an end, and for Rupert to get through all the documents. He had to figure out and untangle the Decca relationship and renegotiating and paying debts to Klein's past agreements and how to figure out and find the money for the tax they owed, that 83 to 98% on their income. We heard that before, a cluster mess. Rupert worked real hard on this and needed not just English lawyers, but American also, as Decca US Division London was involved. As Rupert's company was concerned, Rupert is spending all his time working on the Stones. There was nothing to show as a return, profit, and ROI, return on investment, for Rupert's investment. Now, Rupert did not send an invoice bill to the Stones for his services, not until 3 years later, since he started. In 1972 is when he did that. Rupert had thought his company negotiated a reasonable fee for them, and this would be from the future earnings of the Stones' masters and copyrights, which is what they sold Klein. The Stones signed an astonishing amount of contracts, which was in the past and it could not be improved or changed. Rupert was facing a two-headed monster. Klein's team was seeking songs not claimed yet by the Stones either, whether partial songs or entire songs that should be owed to Klein. Now, Decca was as unhappy with the Stones as much as the Stones were unhappy with them. Decca just had no clue about rock and roll. How about what Decca's head said back in the early days? Why sign the Beatles? They're just a fad and on their way out. Then they went to EMI, so Decca realized the big mistake, and that's why they grabbed the Stones. The publishing deal stated that the Stones were tied up in all their copyrights for all the work they put in or even started and not finished. This meant demos or scraps or audio of jamming for a song was not owned by the Stones. Horrible, atrocious to have this done to an artist. I'm going to mention Marshall Chess, who became the Rolling Stones Records president. I'm also going to get into more detail on him later. But here, this ties into the Decca meeting. This involves Rupert and Marshall, and they would arrive to London and talk to the head man, Sir Edward Lewis. Sir Edward would want to make sure Marshall knew all the details about the Decca Stones affair. Marshall would say, "You got the entire song list." While leaving Decca outside, Marshall is walking with Rupert and a tax specialist lawyer, Mrs. Stacy, who accompanied this meeting also. Marshall just starts laughing out loud and say, there are a huge amount of songs not even talked about. Rupert and Mrs. Stacy, they would stop dead in their tracks, horrified on what they were hearing from Marshall. They immediately called Mick and others. They're going by the book. We have to go back to Decca and tell them there was more unfinished work, which they had rights to. Also, more lawyer work with Klein, and I'm not sure what action steps were taken. There was a British revenue case, an internal case for Special Stones audit. They claimed the Stones were due a large contractual amount for which they have not been taxed. The revenue case team could not believe the amount of contracts, as they now think there's more money involved. Rupert had to appear before the revenue team to give evidence. Now, the prosecutor on the team was genuinely nice. He asked, where was all the money paid by the publishing? They must have gotten that. And Rupert would respond and said he had looked at this in great detail. He couldn't find any. I wish you had asked Mr. Klein what it means. Well, the Inland Revenue team eventually wanted to sue them, but the Stones, they had no money. This is when Rupert had his vision to have the band leave the UK homes. If they did not, they would be paying 83 to 98% of their profits in British income tax and surtax. Rupert gave Mick all the lowdown and all the options and scenarios and how it's a real hostile litigation going on, and to get the band out of some of the contracts. Now, doing this is going to include American and British lawyer costs and Rupert's fees. This time frame was when Mick was doing Ned Kelly in Australia. Mick called Rupert. What shall I do? He was nervous, but had to make a decision. And if he did not want to take Rupert's advice, Rupert would walk away, drop Klein, and leave the country. Mick thought for a moment and would then respond with all, yes, I agree. Around 1970, while negotiations were going on, Mick announced Klein will be replaced by Rupert. And this is where the home away from home started. South of France was great, as this is where the English folks traveled for vacation. It also turned out to be the best for tax. Holland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Ireland, they were good for life activities, but not taxes. Also, Rupert had some great familiarity with south of France from his childhood and spent a lot of time there. After that detail, you'll have to go look at my Exile documentary and pick up from there on that. But the bottom line was a deal was struck with the French authorities. The Stones were allowed to live there and pay a negotiated income tax. But they were getting out of Klein and into Atlantic. Both Decca and Klein's contracts were ending July 30th, 1970. In a lawsuit against Klein accusing him of false and fraudulent representation. With Sticky almost done, they had to compromise with Klein and Decca and identify the rights on masters and copyrights. In 71, the Stones sued Klein over U.S. publishing rights. Now, Amit knew about this terrible scenario, but still had his vision of getting it cleared. He was so smart and a happy, cheerful person, and he took risks. Amit would follow Mick around, making sure he was locked in. There was still no deal yet. Amit would then tell Mick they all needed to meet and make a final decision. So at this time, Mick throws in a curveball to Amit, mentioning he wanted to talk to Clive Davis at Columbia. This would not sit well with Amit. Amick called Mick to tell him Atlantic can only make one big deal this year. It would be either them or Paul Revere and the Raiders. Now, with the Decca contract ending, they had to deliver one more single to them, and Mick knew the perfect right song. Schoolboy Blues, a.k.a. Cocksucker Blues. A protest, so they could not get this single played on the air. A big F.U. to Decca. At the end, they paid Klein to go away, and they still lost full control of their music catalog. All signed over to this shithead just to get rid of him. They couldn't break the Klein contract. He was holding $2 million to be paid over 15 years. In 1971, there was a settlement with Klein. He kept the APCO rights to all the past Stones recordings and administration of their 65 to 71 publishing. And they had to hand-deliver them one more album and release unreleased songs. Stones got $1.25 million, and this were the Decca 60s royalties from 65, and to get more timely payments. But overall, this meant washing their hands and no more Klein. So Mick knew Klein would still strangle the Stones and the music and would not allow a live album with any of these songs, not until 1977. Klein did jump on the issuing of the Stones comps, Milestone, Rock and Rolling Stones, No Stones Unturned, and the bestseller, Hot Rocks. 75 was the release of Metamorphosis. The Stones counterpunched with Made in the Shade. The one album that they owed to London Records, the Stones were with Atlantic already. Hot Rocks was released in 71, 6 months after Sticky. Atlantic was not allowed to sell their version. This was mandated by court. They couldn't sell Hot Rocks. Sometime later, it was found out that Klein had the Stones' lawyer under his payroll. In 74, more negotiations over royalties led to a $375,000 payment to the Stones. 75, more lawsuits and negotiations turned into a $1 million payment to the Stones for songwriting and royalties in the release of 4 albums. Rock and Roll Circus, Roll Gold, and I'm not sure the other 2. 1984, the Glimmer Twins sued APCO to break the publishing agreement for non-payment of royalties. Judge said to all, just reach a friggin' settlement. By 1986, as CDs came about and the industry reaped great profits, the Klein and the Stones camps, they started to see improvement of communications between the two. The 2002 40 Licks album and the Licks tour did incorporate APCO tunes. The Stones would agree to a 5-year payment plan. 2003, APCO and iTunes agreed and negotiated. With the Decca contract coming up, Mick did shop around to sign with the label, looking for the best offer he could find. They tried negotiating with Island, Chris Blackwell, and the same owners of Chess Records, who owned also Blue Thumb Records. In L.A., Bob Krasnow, executive, he tried to lure Mick in. Krasnow pitched Mick plenty, and Mick saw some bizarre behavior. Krasnow was stoned out of his mind, I believe, with mushrooms. He was not contacted back. Now, Krasnow had reached out to Marshall Chess to build a team alliance so they could get the Stones. Marshall said, "Look, let's just be friends, not partners." However, Marshall asks Krasnow for Mick's number. And he calls Mick and he says, "Hey, remember me?" "Of course, Marshall, yeah." Marshall gave him his whole update, that he was in LA talking about his life and chess was sold. And he also said, "I heard Decca contract is up. Can we work on something?" Mick would say, "Can you come to London? I just had my passport held up for having amphetamines in London airport. Can you come to London?" 2 weeks later, Marshall goes. He gets there. He knows Joe Bergman at the Stones office, and she knew he was coming. So Marshall called Joe when he arrived, and Joe says, "Well, Mick is in Ireland writing. Let me call him and tell him you're here." Marshall was pretty upset, but waited 2 days. Mick comes. Mick tells him to come to his home on Cheney Walk in Chelsea. So Marshall goes to Mick's house, a bit nervous. Mick took him up to his sitting room. Mick had albums thrown all over the room floor, just like Marshall does. Mick would go to his stereo and put an album on by Clifton Chenier, a Zydeco pioneer from New Orleans. He puts on Black Snake Blues and starts dancing to it. Now Marshall wanted a label and told Mick they can form a label together. But with games being played, Mick would mention to Marshall that Atlantic was a front runner. He also mentions Columbia also. But Mick has some interest. He tells Marshall to go now down the street and meet Keith, and tonight you can meet the others at a rehearsal room. Marshall arrives at Keith's place, and he has an Italian butler who invited Marshall to go in and to go upstairs. There Marshall sees Keith and Graham Parsons by a piano, playing together and singing. Marshall will mention that both Graham and Keith would sort of mock how Marshall was dressed in his Levi's and t-shirt. Later on, they all get to the rehearsal room, which was in the basement. First thing Marshall sees is the record he produced, Muddy and his Electric Mud album on the wall. This was an omen for Marshall. Now Marshall was dear friends with Jan Wenner. Now Jan and his wife Jane managed Boz Scaggs on Atlantic, but it flopped. Marshall wanted to sign Boz, but it all collapsed. Marshall will tell a lie to the Stones, but he did say this, that he had to know in 2 weeks an answer because he had some Texas millionaires waiting to help him get a label, and he was signing Boz Scaggs. This was all going to happen in 2 weeks, so Marshall needed to know if they wanted to make a deal with a label together. 2 weeks later, Marshall gets a Western Union letter saying, "We want to make a deal, come to London." This is that time when he met Prince Rupert Lowenstein and he went to Decca. Amit then would bring together both Marshall and Lowenstein at the Beverly Hills Hotel, explaining how much he'll do for the Stones if they sign for 5 albums. So they would as a team make the deal with Amit and Atlantic with this new label. Marshall knew Amit as he was at Marshall's bar mitzvah, as he knew his parents way back when. So after that time, that knock on the door for Amit, they would have their Atlantic Records official office meeting on 61st Street in New York City. $1 an album and $1 million in advance per album. The advance would be a clincher for Mick. April 1st, 71, Stones signed with Atlantic under the Rolling Stones label. When Amit visited Mick in his home, Amit laid down a concern. It was about the May 28, 69 drug bust on Cheney Walk for marijuana on a police raid. Marianne was addicted and in bad shape. Amit would really try urging Mick to break it up. A tough task, but Mick cannot jeopardize everything for her. Amit said she'll drag you down to a bottomless pit and those around it go down also. That was his advice. With all the money Atlantic was giving the Stones, Ahmet wanted some guarantee that this deal would not be blown out because of Mary Ann. You understand that, Mick? Mick and Ahmet had no idea Mary Ann was sitting at the top of the stairs hearing all of it. They thought she was out. Mary Ann knew her days were numbered when Lowenstein entered the Stones camp, and she was not a team player. "27-year-old Marshall did close the London Decca deal. Marshall and Rupert, they would get all those extra songs from the Stones on a tape, and they brought these grade B songs to Decca. That's when Mick did Cocksucker Blues, and the Atlantic deal was closed. Rolling Stones Records was formed under Atlantic, and Marshall wanted Atlantic also, as they were his friends. Marshall wanted also to bring in Jimi Hendrix. He was considered to be on Rolling Stones Records with his own logo. The Stones had no money and they were broke at this time. They owned their material things, but did not own any songs to make money. Broke Rupert told Marshall there can be no other artists on this label. There's no money. Rupert wanted Marshall to stay and offered him the president role. Rolling Stones record label lasted until 1992. They signed with Virgin.